Church, as a body, we cling to you this morning. And we are here to learn and to worship and honor you. Amen.
Amen. All right. Well, we're continuing to work through the final week of the life of Christ, the final days. And so today we're going to talk through Friday, the day of the cross. And I call it the day of the great exchange. The great exchange was finished on this day. And so I want to review just a little bit, all right? If you don't, just come back to the 10th day, all right? The first day we looked at, the Monday, all right? This Monday was the first day of this exchange, all right? And this is when it started. And again, we're pushing back to Passover, all right? So the Passover celebration, it was set up. God gives it to Moses. He says, on the 10th day of Nisan, on the 10th day of this first month, all right, which was the Monday of this Passion Week, he said, I want you to go out and I want you to select a lamb, unblemished lamb, bring them, set them aside, and hold on to them until the 14th day, the Friday, which is the day we're going to talk about today. And so we start with this day, and Jesus rides into Jerusalem to the shouts of what? Hosanna. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So it's this overwhelming exuberance of the people there. They think their Messiah has come. They're anointing their Messiah. And they're shouting, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And we know this 10th day of Nisan, the 880th day since the decree of King Artaxerxes, which is all recorded in Daniel 9. This was the day that Christ was going to come in. This was the day the Lamb would be selected. All right? So you go the next day, on the 11th day, the Tuesday, Jesus rides into town, and as soon as he walks in the door, he's met by questions. He's met by doubts. He's met by traps. And he starts telling parables against the religious leaders of the day. And it's just this whole day of confrontation and conflict. It is a hard day for Jesus. And as they're leaving the temple that night, he stops in the court of women. And he stops in there and he just sits and he watches. And all the people are coming in and offering their massive offerings. They're pouring big jugs of coins and stuff into the treasury. And all of a sudden, an elderly widow lady walks up and drops 2 coins. It's all she had to live on. And I think that made his day. You see, all day long he had been looking. He had been hungering for people to see him, to see his righteousness. And at the end of the day, he saw it. Now they walk out of the temple gates, and they head on their way out. You got to remember Jesus with his disciples. Now his disciples are young men; they're probably teenagers, 20-somethings. All right, and they live in a small town, Capernaum, Bethsaida. All right, around the Sea of Galilee, small villages. They've never seen anything like the temple. So as they're walking out of the temple, I think they kind of look back at night and they see the torches lighting this whole place up. In this 35-acre complex, one of the great wonders of the ancient world. And they look at Jesus and go, Jesus, look at these stones. Look how amazing this place is, which I think was hard for Jesus because after a long day of teaching and going and doing hand-to-hand combat with these guys, he kind of looks back and he goes, I'll tell you this, not one stone will be left on another. They will not be thrown down. And that just silenced them. So they leave the temple area. They go down the Kidron Valley, back up the Mount of Olives, and they're kind of camping out, getting settled in for the night. That's where they're going to spend the night. And I think Jesus kind of slips away and sort of sits on the Mount of Olives, just overlooking the city of Jerusalem. And he sits there, and Peter, Andrew, James, and John come up and go, wait a second, what was this stones being thrown down thing? And what is the sign of your coming, the Messiah's coming, and the end of the age? When is this all going to go down? So Jesus takes Matthew 24 and 25, and he lays out an end-time scenario. We call this the Olivet Discourse. This is the Wednesday. It was probably Wednesday morning when he was doing all this. And he's teaching them all of these things. And he tells parables, and he gets to the parable of the sheep and the goats, and he says, at the end, the judgment is going to come, and we're going to divide. Everyone will be divided. And to one he will say, come into your kingdom, prepared for you from the beginning of the world. And they'll say, well, why? He said, because when I was hungry, when I was thirsty, you gave me something to eat. You gave me something to drink. You visited me. He said, when do we see you do all these things? When you did this to the least of these. To the others, he's going to say, depart from me, I never knew you. And they say, why? Because when I was hungry and thirsty, you did nothing. Paul writes to the Galatian church, the only thing that matters is your faith, what you believe, energizing your love for other people. That's it. That's all that matters. And on that final day of judgment, as Jesus was saying on that Wednesday morning, that's the only thing that's going to matter. We move to Thursday. This is the day of the Last Supper. And Jesus is sitting with his disciples, and he takes the bread and he breaks it. He says, take it, eat of it. This is my body that will be broken for you. None of them had any clue that within about 12 hours, all of that would come true. He takes the cup. He says, drink this. All of you, drink from this. This is the blood that establishes the covenant. And what was that covenant? It was a covenant of peace. It was a covenant that says, I will take your sin and your shame. You take my blood. You take my righteousness. And I will exchange this. So Jesus leaves that night, goes back up to the Mount of Olives, goes to this garden called Gethsemane. And he's still got the cup. We talked about this last week, the cup of wrath. This cup of all the sin and the shame. My sin, my shame, your sin, your shame. In that cup. And Jesus is sitting there staring at it and goes, God, if there's any other way, I don't want to drink the cup of your wrath. I don't think Jesus was afraid of the pain. I think he was human. I think anyone would be afraid of the pain. But I don't think that's what he was running from. I don't think that was what he was trying to get away from. I think he dreaded the wrath of God. That was the thing he was afraid of. That was the thing he dreaded. But yet he said what? Father, if there's any other way, please do it. But if not, your will be done. He prays that for hours. 3 times he goes back. We've talked about how 3 times, anytime you see something done 3 times, you know it's sort of a superlative. It's an extreme. So he prays it 3 times. And he gets up from there. He walked into that night full of sorrow and distress and pain and stressed out over all this to the point of death. But he gets up from there. And not one time for the rest of the Gospels does it ever say he was sorrowful or stressed. It was settled. He was steeled in what he was going to do. So he got up from there. And about that time, Judas walks up with a group of soldiers. All right? Now, these were probably not Roman soldiers. There's no reason to think these were Roman soldiers. These were most likely sort of the guards of the high priest. All right? He would have sort of his little guard that he would bring with him. And these people would come in, and they came into there. And Peter has to be tough, right? So Peter draws his sword as they're coming to take Jesus because he's going to stay with Jesus because he told him he would, right? He said, I won't run away. I will never run away. And he takes his sword and cuts off the ear of a guy named Malchus, slave of the high priest. And Jesus touches his ear and heals him. And I think in that moment it's when he looks at Peter and he says, Peter, don't you get it? I could call down 12 legions of angels if I wanted to. But I don't want to. I choose you, Peter. I choose to drink this cup of the wrath. I choose to exchange your sin for my blood. I choose this. I don't choose to be safe. Don't you see? Don't you understand, Peter? Don't you see what I'm doing? Of course, he didn't. But we can. And that's what we want to talk about today. So let's pick up the story there. I'm in Matthew 26. I should get there. Matthew 26 in verse 57. So we're going to pick up, we're going to read a little bit, talk about it. But I want to see this, and I want to talk about this exchange. Paul picks up on it later on in 2 Corinthians 5. If you give me one chapter in the Bible that explains what Christ has done and what I need to be doing about it, I think 2 Corinthians 5 would be in my top 3 or 4. All right, give me Luke 15. I like the prodigal son. All right, give me the story of the cross. But 2 Corinthians 5, it just tells me exactly what happened and what I need to be doing about it. And at the last verse in there it says, he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us so that we might become the righteousness of God. And so what I want you to see today is this exchange that takes place. The word reconciliation in the text there, it's the word for exchange. It's katalasso. It means to exchange things. And so what I want you to do, And I want you to think about this, because if you ever watch like a Mission Impossible movie, you have these moments in the movie where a quick exchange takes place, and just as you're watching, you don't really pick up on it. And then they kind of double back on it and go, didn't you see when that happened? And they get right to that point of exchange, and all of a sudden what happens? It goes into slow-mo. It goes into slow-mo, and you see the briefcase exchanged, or the person pick up the knife, or whatever. That moment, it's just slow-mo, and you go, oh, I didn't see that. Well, here's what I want you to do with the Friday. Here's what I want you to hit these moments, and I want us to hit slow-mo, and I want you to see these moments where Christ, God in the flesh, took your sin and gave you salvation. And they made this great exchange, all right? So let's start reading. I'm in verse 57. Those who had arrested Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now, again, this is why I don't think it was Roman soldiers. Roman soldiers would not take Jesus to Caiaphas. Roman soldiers didn't even know that Jesus needed to be arrested, all right? These were Jewish high priests that had gone out. Judas has betrayed him. Now they know where he is. They're sending their people out, and they're brought to him, all right? So don't think these are Roman soldiers out there in the Garden of Gethsemane. These are Jewish soldiers, where the scribes and elders had already convened, okay? Now, everything about this trial is illegal. I'll just put that on the table, all right? I wrote a paper about this in seminary. Everything they did that night was illegal. You can't have trials at night. You can't have trials where there was a unanimous decision. It's just all sorts of stuff that's illegal, all right? I'll be glad to go through that if you want me to later on at some point, all right? 58. Meanwhile, Peter was following him at a distance right to the high priest's courtyard. He went in and was sitting in the temple with the temple police to see the outcome. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false testimony, which should tell you a lot about this trial. They are looking for false testimony, all right, against Jesus so they could put him to death. It was like, okay, we've got the verdict. Let's figure out a way to prove what we think he's already done, all right? We've seen that before, right? But they could not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, 2 came forward who stated, this man said, I can demolish God's sanctuary and rebuild it in 3 days. Now, Matthew doesn't have the record of that. It's in John 2, which makes me think John 2, the cleansing of the temple in John 2, when Jesus says, demolish this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days. That was really at this time. Remember on Monday when Jesus rides in on the triumphal entry? He goes directly into the temple, and what does he do? He clears the temple. Well, John 2 records that, but that seems to be early. I think John 2 is right here, because I don't think they remember 3 years ago what Jesus said. I think they remember 4 days ago what Jesus said. And so they're repeating this. But even this testimony didn't agree. Verse 62 says this, the high priest then stood up and said to him, don't you have an answer to what these men are testifying against you? But Jesus kept silent. Now, you need to understand, they had something like the Fifth Amendment, all right? You can plead the Fifth. You do not have to incriminate yourself, all right? If you're ever on trial, they cannot call you forward and put you on the witness stand and say, did you kill Bob, all right? You can't do that. And just like in our system of jurisprudence, Jesus didn't have to answer a thing. He could have stayed silent throughout this entire thing. But what would that have meant for us? If Jesus had tried to save his life that night and remained silent, what would that have meant for us? So he's being accused of all these small things, and he keeps silent in this whole thing. Then the high priest said to him, by the living God, I place you under oath. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. Now, what are his options? The high priest says, I place you under oath. You know what Jesus could have done? Stayed silent. A lot of people portray this. Even some books like The Murder of Jesus, these books, it almost implies Jesus got trapped. Oh no, he caught me. Now he's placed me under oath. I have to say what I have to say. That's not true at all. He could have remained silent. He could have sat there and go, well, that's nice that you placed me under oath. I still have the right to remain silent. I still have the right to say nothing. You have to prove that I'm guilty in this. But this was the moment. Remember at Gethsemane, he didn't say, God, give me a way out, but if not, my will be done still. He said, I know your will, Father. I know your will is for me to drink this cup of wrath. So in this moment, he sees the moment where he's going to lay down his life, not where his life will be taken away. He was not tricked into this. He was not cornered into this. He saw a moment, and he says, this is the moment where I will lay down my life. So read this again. This is where you got to pause in this moment in the movie, and you can see this. All right? Let's pick up in 62 again. The high priest then stood up and said to him, don't you have an answer to what these men are testifying against you? But Jesus kept silent. Then the high priest said to him, by the living God, I place you under oath. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. Now let it slow down. Let it go slow-mo here. Let Jesus kind of take this moment in. Let him take a deep breath. Pause. And then he says, you have said it. Now, in Hebrew, in biblical talk, that is, yes, I am the Messiah. When he says, you have said it, saying, I'm agreeing with what you just said. Yes, I am the Messiah. And I think this was such a stark moment. It's almost like he says this, and then he just gets on a roll now. I'm not just going to admit it. I'm going to give you some Bible lessons too. So he says, you have said it, but I tell you in the future, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming on clouds of heaven. Now, he's quoting Psalm 110, and he's quoting Daniel 7:13. And these are powerful, powerful statements. The one in 110 is, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. I will destroy anyone who comes against you. So he says, not only am I the Messiah, but I'm going to be told to have a seat until God destroys you. Now, that had to be an interesting moment. And then he says, not only that, but I am also the Son of Man who is going to be coming on the clouds of heaven. And what happens in Daniel 7:13 is this, and you can look this up later. The Son of Man comes before the throne of the Ancient of Days, and the Ancient of Days gives him the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Well, see, the thing is, these people thought they were going to get the kingdom. And Jesus, not only does he say, yes, I am the Messiah, but this is who I am. This is who I am from your ancient scriptures. And it had to have had just devastating effect. Look at what happens after this. 65. Then the high priest tore his robe. Not supposed to do that, by the way. All right, Exodus 21, not supposed to do that. And said, he has blasphemed. Why do we still need witnesses? Look, now you've heard the blasphemy. To which I have the question. Did Jesus confess to committing blasphemy? Or did he commit blasphemy right there on the witness stand? Okay, so it's one thing to confess on the witness stand that you did something. It's a whole nother thing to actually commit the crime right there on the witness stand. And that's what he did for you. That's what he did in your place. He could have remained silent, but he committed the crime in their eyes of blasphemy right there on the witness stand. What did he do? He exchanged his freedom for your condemnation. You stand condemned before a holy God, and he says, okay, I could be free, but I will exchange this. I will let you have it. And all of a sudden, we go free because he took our condemnation. And in this moment, if he had remained silent, we would have all been lost. We would have all been hopelessly lost away from the presence of God because of the wrath that's due us from the justice that is perfectly just for him to reject us because of our rebellion and our sin and our shame. But that's not what this day is all about. This day is about an exchange. This day is a day when Jesus says, you take my righteousness, I'll take your guilt. And he committed the crime right before them so that it would lead to his death, so that it would lead to his atoning work there on the cross. All right, let's keep going because we've got to move on. All right, so we leave Caiaphas. So they start to rough him up. They start to beat him. They spit in his face. All these things, and eventually they take him on to Pilate. Now go jump to Matthew 27:1. When daybreak came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. And after tying him up, they led him away and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. Then Judas, his betrayer, seeing that he had been condemned, was full of remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver. We know that Judas is going to go out and hang himself after this, just in his sense of remorse. I always wonder if he would just repented and asked for forgiveness, if he would have been okay. I don't know. That's a whole theological matter. Now, jump down to verse 11. Now, Jesus stood before the governor, all right? And the governor asked him this, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Okay? Now, that didn't just come out of nowhere. Luke tells us that the initial accusations against Jesus by the chief priests were he subverts the nation, he tells people not to pay taxes to Caesar, and he thinks he's the king of the Jews, to which I think Pilate picks up and goes, and he looks at Jesus and goes, "Do you think you're the king of the Jews?" And Jesus replies, "You have said it." Now, at this moment, does Pilate say, that's it, the trial's over, he's committing treachery, he thinks he's the king, we can't have this, go crucify him? No, Pilate acts like he didn't even say anything. I don't think Pilate takes him seriously at all. So this accusation, this crime that he is committing right there of this, yes, I am the king, Pilate doesn't even blink at this thing. He does not take this seriously. Now, my question, I always am curious about this. Was Jesus the rightful king in the line of David? Now, we have no idea. We have no idea where the line of David went and how it went along and how if Jesus would have been the person in line to be the king at some point in this. We have no idea. But Pilate doesn't take him seriously at all. It's as if he says nothing there. So go back to verse 11. Now Jesus stood before the governor. "Are you the king of the Jews?" the governor asked him. And Jesus answered, "You have said it." And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he did not answer. Again, he's going back to the silence. You know why? Because it's over. He doesn't need to say anything else. He knows this path is going to take him to the cross. He doesn't need to say another word. He does not need to entertain. He does not need to engage whatsoever with the rest of the people. His plan is fully in place, and it's going to lead to his death, which leads to your salvation. Verse 13 says this, "Then Pilate said to him, 'Don't you hear how much they are testifying against you?' But he didn't answer him even one charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed." Now, at the festival, this is the Passover festival, all right? At the Passover festival, the governor's custom was to release to the crowd a prisoner they wanted. All right, so Pilate has his custom. All right, Passover was a celebration of this sort of freeing out of Egypt, going and you're free, everybody's good. So the governor comes up with this thing, goes, "I'll release one of the prisoners that you want. All right, so you just yell out whatever prisoner you want. I'll let him go. We'll have a good time, whatever. All right, it's not a big deal to me one way or the other if I throw a criminal back into your midst. All right? And so at that time, they had, in verse 16, at that time they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. All right? Now, notorious, he was notable. Everybody knew who this guy was. All right? He would be a famous criminal. All right? Everybody knew he was a bad guy. Mark and Luke tell us that he had committed murder in the midst of a rebellion. All right? So you can't get a more heinous crime in the Jewish understanding than murder. All right? To take a life. And you can't get a more heinous crime in the Roman culture than to commit rebellion against the emperor. All right? So this is what we're looking at. So when they had gathered together, Pilate said to them, "Who is it you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Messiah?" For he knew they had handed him over because of envy. Now, what's Pilate trying to do? What's he trying to set up? He knows they handed Jesus over out of envy. Luke tells us 3 times, in 3 occasions, actually John says it as well, on 3 occasions, Pilate says, "What's he done? This guy's done nothing. I found no grounds to kill him, to do anything to him." It's this idea, again, you go back to the Passover, an unblemished lamb, an innocent lamb. He's committed no sin. He's committed no crime. 3 times he says that. Now compare that to Barabbas. What do you find in Barabbas? A notorious prisoner who has committed murder. He's taken life. You can't get any worse than that in Jewish culture. And he's committed rebellion. You can't get any worse than that in a Roman culture. And Pilate thinks, I got him. I'll throw somebody up here so heinous, so hated, so evil that they'll have to pick Jesus. And then I'll let Jesus go, and I'll go, ha ha, you tried to trick me because you just hate this Jesus guy, and I'll let him go. But what do they say? What does the evil in the heart of mankind say in this very moment? The one who has no sin, we choose Barabbas. And they cry out, Barabbas, give us Barabbas, give us Barabbas. And he says, well, what am I supposed to do with Jesus then? And what does this crowd of Jewish citizens who hate the Romans, what do they ask for? Do to him the very thing we hate that you do to our people. The Romans, to embarrass people, would crucify them. They would put them on a cross and leave them beside the road so people would walk by them. They would leave them up there for days. It was the ultimate in shame. It was the ultimate in degradation. And that's what the Jewish people on this day asked Pilate to do to Jesus. Now, here's what I want you to think about. I know what Pilate was trying to do. Pilate was trying to get cute and try to play one against another and trying to get them to release Jesus so that they could kind of put it in his face. What was God trying to tell you on this day? Now, again, let's go back and slow this thing down. So you have Barabbas and you have Jesus standing there. You couldn't get a bigger sinner. You could not get someone more offensive to God and the government. You could not possibly. And you have Jesus, one who has committed no sin, no grounds for any type of punishment. What's God trying to tell you when he says, I'm going to let Barabbas go, and Jesus will literally die on the cross that belonged to Barabbas that day? What's he telling you? How bad is your sin? You see, the enemy's going to come to you and is going to say, no, you've sinned too much. You've done too much. There's no way God can forgive you. There's no way God would take your place. Well, God took the place of the most notorious, heinous criminal in all of Jerusalem on that day. And he said, I will exchange my place. I always wonder if Barabbas was ever told the story of Jesus. I wonder what happened to Barabbas. There's been several movies made. They're out there. They're sort of fictional, bad movies, all right? But I always just wonder. But what do you know? The most heinous criminal and the guiltless one exchanged places that day. And one walked away. You see, if you don't see yourself in Barabbas, you've completely missed the point of the gospel. If you do not see the heinous nature of your sin and the fact that Christ died in your place anyway, you've completely missed the gospel. Let's keep moving on. So they hand Jesus over to be crucified. All right, I got to catch up with my place. Come on down here to verse 27. They hand Jesus over. He's going to be flogged. They hand him over to be crucified. In verse 27, it says, then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the headquarters and gathered the whole company around him. All right? So these are Roman soldiers now. These aren't Jewish soldiers. These are Roman soldiers. All right? They stripped him and dressed him in a scarlet military robe. All right, very traditional Roman garb. This is a scarlet robe. They put him in this. What they're going to do is they're going to prop him up and they're just going to mock him and abuse him. So he's stripped, he's put this robe around him. They twisted together a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and placed a reed in his right hand. And they knelt down before him and mocked him. Hail, King of the Jews! Then they spit on him and took the reed and kept hitting him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe and put his clothes back on him, and they led him away to crucify him. Just to embarrass him. Just to create more shame. This is all they were doing. But here's the thing, and you may have missed it in the moment. So let's back up, rewind the thing, and let's slow this down. You see, they stripped him of his clothes and dressed him in a military robe. and they twisted together a crown of thorns. And then they did what? Slow down here. They took the crown of thorns and they did what with it? Placed it on his head. Now, if you go back and you read the Old Testament, in the sacrifices, anytime there was a sacrifice, Abraham, when he goes to sacrifice his son Isaac, right before you sacrifice the animal, what are you supposed to do? You take your hands and you lay your hands on the head of the animal that's going to die in your place. Did y'all see that? Did I slow it down enough for you? They take the crown of thorns, and what did they do with it? They place it on his head. The imputation of sin, the exchange takes place. Now, no one ever picks up on that, so I'm not going to go too far with that. But look at that picture over and over and over. Every time you see it, if you make it through Leviticus, God bless you if you can make it through Leviticus. But once you see this in Leviticus, it'll be a piece of cake to read through this. You'll see the imputation, the exchange of your sin for righteousness. And this soldier just places it on there. I'm sure he doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know. He's not imputing his sins, but look at what takes place. Look at the exchange that takes place right here. Now, what are we going to see with the soldiers later on? Later on, they get to the cross and they crucify him, and they gamble for his clothes, right? And one of them walks away clothed in the garment of Christ. Did you see that? Did you see the exchange? I mean, what does Paul say? Put on the righteousness of Christ. Clothe yourself with a new self. Clothe yourself with something new. So this soldier, I don't know if it's the same one. I don't even know any of this. All I know is one of the soldiers places his hands on the head of Christ. And one of the soldiers walks away that day clothed in the garment of Jesus. That's the exchange. That's what you can do. That's what you can do today. You can place your hands on the head of Christ. It doesn't matter. Barabbas, every sin you can imagine, the most heinous criminal possible. Place your hands on the head of Christ. Impute your sin. Give him your sin. And you can walk away today clothed in the righteous garment of Christ. That's the beauty of the exchange. That's what's in play today. Now, we're going to talk about Simon of Cyrene. So as they were going out, if you read in verse 32, Matthew 27:32, as they were going out, they found a Cyrenian man named Simon, and they forced this man to carry his cross, Jesus' cross. Now, here's what I want to do. I want to read this from the Mark version. So if you can flip over, come over here to Mark. In Mark, verse, where'd he go? Mark 15, verse 21. They forced a man coming in from the country, all right? Now, Cyrene is Libya, okay? So he would have been visiting from out of town. He would probably been a Jewish person visiting from out of town from Libya, coming to the Passover celebration. They crucified they forced a man coming in from the country who was passing by to carry Jesus' cross. Now, slow down real quick here. Put this in slow-mo. Whose cross? Whose cross is Simon of Cyrene carrying? He's carrying the cross of Jesus. Why is Jesus carrying a cross? Whose cross did he take? Jesus did nothing wrong. Pilate says 3 times, I find no grounds to charge him, no grounds to charge him, no grounds to charge him. No one can lay any claim whatsoever on him. But Simon of Cyrene is a guilty man, just like you are and just like I am. So whose cross is being carried? You see, Simon took Jesus' cross and carried it the rest of the way. Why? Because Jesus took his cross. This was the exchange. Now, here's the really cool part in Mark. Watch this. Now, you got to understand, Mark was written probably in Rome about 30 years after this takes place, and Peter is probably telling Mark stories, or he's heard Peter tell enough stories where Mark is writing this from Peter's perspective, all right? And so Mark records these events, and he says they forced a man coming into the country who was passing by to carry Jesus' cross. He was Simon, a Cyrenian, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Now, when in the Bible have you ever seen someone refer to their children? This was this man, and his sons were Bob and Frank. When do we ever see that? In fact, it goes the other way, doesn't it? It says, this is Zechariah, and his father was things we can't pronounce and things we can't pronounce. All right? And it goes backwards. Well, this one goes the other way. Why? The fascinating thing, when Paul writes to the Roman church, in Romans 16:13, he writes, "Greet Rufus, who was chosen in the Lord." Now, if Mark is writing his gospel from Rome, and he mentions Simon carried his cross, and his sons were Alexander and Rufus, and now Paul is writing to the Roman church and saying, hey, tell Rufus I said hello. You know him. He was the one chosen in the Lord. Now, is that the same person? We don't know, but it's the same name. And this idea of naming the children just goes against everything we would find in Scripture. There could be some connection. So here's my question. When the exchange takes place, when Jesus takes Simon's cross, and then Jesus carries it far as he can, and then Simon takes Jesus' cross, and this exchange is sort of this ironic exchange of the exchange of the exchange. And then what does he do with the exchange? What does he do when he recognizes when Jesus dies, when the stories come out of the resurrection of Christ? He picks his cross back up. And just like Paul says, I have been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. I think Simon gives up his cross. Jesus carries it. He picks it back up. And then after he dies, Simon says, now I will deny myself, take up my cross, and I will follow him. Rufus, Alexander, come on, let me tell you the story of Jesus. You see, that's who we have to be. That's who we have to be in this moment, parents. Those of us sitting at home with really nothing to do, hours and hours of boredom. Hey, how about you pick up your cross and teach your children so that someday Paul writes to Rufus and says, tell him I said hello. You see, when that exchange is made, it changes everything about your life. And it did for Simon, I believe. Now, let's go a little farther. There were two criminals. To do this, you got to go to the Luke version of this, all right? So keep coming over here. Come over here to Luke 23 in verse 32. In Luke 23:32, two others, criminals. These are called kakos ergon. It means evildoers. We've talked about kakos a lot in here. Kakos is when you're just mean, horrible, just a horrible person, all right? You talk bad about people. You complain all the time. You're just mean, and you're ugly, and you're just not a nice person at all right? So that's kakos. Kalos over here is you're just awesome to everybody. Even if they're mean to you, you just respond with grace and kindness and goodness and all these things. And so that's who we want to be. Well, this is not who these two criminals were, all right? These were kakos ergon, evil doers, workers of evil, all right? And again, isn't this a cool picture? One more time. We got Barabbas, who was the most heinous criminal of his time, and God says, not a problem. And then we have these two criminals that are going to be right beside Jesus. So Jesus counted among them. He becomes unrighteous. Just like it says in the covenant with David in 2 Samuel 7. When he becomes unrighteous, I will discipline him, but my love will never leave him. So these two criminals are crucified with him. Again, Luke 23, verse 32. Two other criminals were also led away to be executed with him. When they arrived at the place called the Skull, they crucified him there. I've always been fascinated, but just that's all you get. And they crucified him. And then the story moves on. You would think this would hold a whole chapter of how they did it and what they did and all these things and what went into it, but all it says, and they crucified him. They crucified him there along with the criminals. One is right and one is left. Then Jesus said, Father, forgive them because they do not know what they are doing. And they divided his clothes and cast lots. The people stood watching, and even the leaders kept scoffing. He saved others. Let him save himself, if this is God's Messiah, the chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him. Then they came offering him sour wine and said, if you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. An inscription was above him. It read, this is the king of the Jews. Now you got to just let this sit for a while because we have about 3 hours between the time he is crucified and the time darkness comes on the earth. So there's all sorts of time that can kind of flow here. In verse 39, it says this. Then one of the criminals hanging there began to yell insults at him, just joining in with the crowd. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. Don't you feel the evil in this man? Just the evil. You're being crucified. You're next to a guy. You're being crucified. He's being crucified. And you're mocking him. Not in a good position to mock anybody. All right? Verse 60. But the other. Legend has him called Dismas. D-Y-S-M-A-S. Dismas, the thief on the cross. But the other answered, rebuking him, don't you even fear God, since you are undergoing the same punishment? We are punished justly because we are getting back what we deserve for the things we did. But this man has done nothing wrong. How does he know that? What has Pilate said 3 times? He's done nothing wrong. He's done nothing wrong. He has watched this man carry his cross and then be helped carrying the cross. He has watched him go all the way up to the cross. He watched him be nailed to that cross. And he's sitting there watching, and for hours watched how people insulted him and spit on him. And he looks with pity on Jesus. He goes, I don't think he's done anything wrong. I wonder how well he knew Jesus or knew of Jesus. I wonder if he'd heard the stories of who Jesus was. So he looks at Jesus. In verse 42, it says, then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Why? What's Jesus supposed to remember about him? Is Jesus supposed to go up into his kingdom and go, hey, Dad, Father, I want you to meet Dismas. He's never done a good thing in his life. He is defined in the Bible as a kakos ergon, an evil doer. He was caught stealing. And the Romans hated him so much that they crucified him. How's that? How's that, Dismas? Is that what you want me to tell my father when I remember you? No, what's he saying? He's saying, Jesus, just remember me. I've done nothing worthy of being remembered. All I've done in my life is evil. But in this moment, in the moment he is about to die, he looks at Jesus and he begs for mercy. Remember me. Not remember my crimes, not remember all the evil I've done. Just remember me, your creature. And Jesus doesn't look at him and say, I'm not going to remember you. You're being crucified by the Romans. Why would I remember you? Where's your list of good deeds that give you any right to come into my kingdom? You see, we get caught up in that. And the enemy tries to accuse us of this. And the enemy tries to hold this against us and says, you're not worthy. You've done this, and you've done this, and you've done this. Why would you even bother Jesus with this? But you see, God so loved the world that he remembered Dismas when he came into his kingdom. And it didn't matter that all he'd ever known was evil. I actually had somebody tell me one time, I don't believe in deathbed conversions. I don't believe people can just at the end of their life decide they want to go to heaven and they pray a prayer and they're all in. I just don't believe that. And I said, well, you may want to check yourself. Because anybody that doesn't believe that Jesus can forgive somebody doesn't know Jesus at all. And I said, I don't necessarily believe that people who don't believe in deathbed conversions will go to heaven. He was not amused by that point. But if anybody is in heaven, if there's anyone that's ever lived that's in heaven, it's the thief on the cross. Jesus never said, Peter, you will be in heaven. Never told John, you will be in heaven. Never told any of his disciples, you will be in heaven. But this guy did. And what did he do to deserve this? Absolutely nothing. What was the reason for the exchange? What was the merit? Nothing. Don't you get it? You don't get to go to heaven because you're such a wonderful person. And normally you walk into a building on Sunday morning. Not now, but normally, all right? You get to walk into heaven, into the presence of God, because an exchange was made for your sin and your shame for Christ's righteousness, period. And all you get to say is, thank you. That's it. Now, what I would love is if Jesus would have said, you're good, but you know what? You're not dying today. Poof. And he poofs him away, and the guy lives out his life, having been forgiven, having been given this second chance at life, have been given this exchange, and knowing that he's going to have salvation. What would this man have done with the rest of his days? With the forgiveness given to him, the salvation given to him, what would he have done? You prove it. You show it. Isn't that the deal you have? You're not nailed to a cross. You weren't nailed to a cross, but you were given this exchange of righteousness. Now, what will you do with it? What will you do with this life that Christ has just handed to you? In spite of all of your sin, in spite of all of your shame. And don't for a second, again, don't you dare tell me, oh, well, I've done too much. You are not Barabbas, but you're just as bad as Barabbas. You're not a thief on a cross, but you're just as bad as one. You see, this is the exchange. You don't walk in with, here's my list of I've done good. You walk in with, here's my sin and my shame. And Christ says, I got you. I got you. Here, take my blood. All of you drink from it. I will take your sin and your shame, and I will go to the cross. Did you see these exchange moments? Did you see where the sin and the shame was given to Christ, and he took it? Because the one who knew no sin became sin on my behalf so that I might become the righteousness of God. This exchange took place. At noon, the sky was darkened. It got a little scary that day. Jesus cries out at one point, Eloi, Eloi, sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, if you go to the psalm that Psalm 22 begins with the words, my God, why have you forsaken me? If you go through that, it's almost as if David is watching the crucifixion take place and he's writing out the details. It's 1,000-year-old prophecy, prophetic psalm that describes almost detail by detail through the events of the cross. And at the end of this, Jesus sighs, takes a deep breath. The Gospels give it different accounts. And he cries out in a loud voice, what? What is the last thing Jesus cries out? It is finished. What's finished? The exchange. The exchange of your sin for his righteousness. The exchange of, I cannot get into the kingdom with, here's your invitation to the kingdom. Finished. The moment his heart stopped beating was the moment you received righteousness. And it covers you. If you will place your hands on the head of Christ. If you will say, Christ, take my sins, take my shame, take all that I've done. That's the invitation. You want me to prove the invitation to you? You want me to prove that God in that moment was saying, come on, all of you, come to me. The exchange is done. What happens at the moment Christ dies? The temple curtain. This is a 4-inch thick curtain. It's probably 60 feet high. It said it ripped, torn from where? From the top to the bottom. And the curtain, which covered up the most holy place, was opened up. Why? So you could dwell with God. That was the invitation. The exchange took place, and then God opened up the curtain and says, now who will come? Who will come? Bring your sin, bring your shame. Leave your list of do-goods at home. Who will come and receive this exchange? Now, for those of us who have already received this exchange, I ask you this, what are you doing about it? You don't do it so that God will forgive you. You do that because God has forgiven you. You get to live the life that the thief on the cross never got to live. You get to be the one who worships in his place. So as you receive his salvation, if you receive this exchange, I'm daring you, go live like the thief on the cross would have lived his life, in amazing, marked appreciation for the blood and the exchange given by Christ. Hey, let's pray. Father, what an amazing thing that you did for us. God, it's almost unfathomable that you would love us this much. There is no reason that you should love us. There is no reason that you should ever come to this earth, leave your throne of glory, take on human flesh, and die in my place. I'm not worthy of that. I've done nothing that would merit that. But Father, you loved me because you created me. You created all of us. And because of that, you have such a profound love for us that you would not allow us to suffer eternally. I thank you, God, that on that Friday, you stepped into my place. You exchanged your righteousness for my guilt and my shame so that I could be righteous. And Father, I pray the words of Paul, 2 Corinthians 5, verse 14 and 15. I pray this as a dare to myself and a challenge to everyone listening to me. That this is the prayer of the saint, the prayer of the one who's received the exchange, who've placed their hands on the head of Christ and received this salvation, this exchange. Paul wrote to the Corinthians, he said, for Christ's love compels us. I am compelled, sent out, held onto by the love of Christ, that since we have reached this conclusion, if one died for all, then all of us have died. And he died for all so that those who live, those of us who live, those of us who, unlike the thief on the cross, can get up and move and speak and talk and share and give, those of us that live should no longer live for ourselves, but for the one who died for them and was raised. Father, that is our prayer. That we would recognize your love. And it would compel us not to live lives that bring glory and honor and fame and fortune and treasure to us. But Father, that we live our lives like Simon of Cyrene, who took up that cross and followed you. That we would be people who truly demonstrate our gratitude for all you have blessed us with. Father, that is our prayer. That is our hope. That is our absolute ambition in light of your cross. And I pray all this in Jesus' name.